with the National Black Child Development Institute. Thank you for joining our virtual Q&A discussion, What's Working? A conversation with Fair Count on the importance of the 2020 census for Black communities, as part of this year's National Black Child Development Week. This session features Fair Count Program Director, Ed Reed. Ed Reed is a Virginia native with over a decade of experience in state federal politics, nonprofit organization, and state government. At Fair Count, Ed is the staff liaison for the Black Man Count initiative, where he cultivates relationships between Fair Count and community-based partners and supervises the faith, technology, and field programs. This is a critical discussion being moderated by Dr. Bisa Batten Lewis. Bisa is the founder of CEO of Ideal Learning LLC, an education consulting and training firm. She is a published author of education and parenting articles, college textbooks, children's books and music, and WINGS Curriculum, a nationally recognized learning system for ages birth to year 5. In May 2018, Dr. Bisa was elected to serve as president of the National Black Child Development Institute Atlanta chapter, BCDI Atlanta, Georgia's affiliate of the National Black Child Development Institute. Please welcome Ed Reed and Dr. Bisa Batten Lewis.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. Do we have Dr. Lewis?
Hello, how are you guys? Good afternoon. Can you guys hear me?
We can. Good afternoon. How are you?
Great, great, great. Thank you, Lindsay.
You're welcome.
All right, so Ed, thank you so much for joining us for National Black Child Development Week. We are definitely appreciate the partnership that you have, Fair Count has with BCDI Atlanta. You're such a great partner. We appreciate all of the resources that you offer us, and we'll get into that and the importance of the census as well. So again, thank you for accepting the invitation. We know how busy you guys are during this time, especially with the census in full effect. So can you tell us a little more about yourself and about Fair Count?
Sure. So again, my name is Ed Reed. I am the program director at Fair Count, Inc. And this is actually my 1 year anniversary with Fair Count. So it's very fitting to be with you all this afternoon to sort of celebrate. But we are a relatively, new nonprofit, and we were launched last March, so, a little over a year. And the primary focus of our work at Fair Count has been focused on the 2020 census. And so our mission is to partner with so-called hard to count communities in Georgia, but also across the nation to ensure a fair and accurate count in 2020. But the second part of our mission, which is really important, particularly now with everything that's going on, is to make sure that we're strengthening the pathways to greater civic participation. So we like to say when we're going into communities, we don't like to be extractive. We like to, create infrastructure that will be around for decades to come. We don't feel that, in 2030 that we should have to create this infrastructure from the census all over again. This is a conversation around civic engagement and participation that will continue to go on. And it's great to have, partners like BCDI, particularly in Atlanta and Georgia, that are helping in this fight to ensure that we have that infrastructure. And so I really enjoyed working for Fair Count. And I know we'll talk a little bit about how we've had to pivot into this virtual world, and it's been a little bit different, I will say, but we've tried to not skip a beat as much as possible to ensure that outreach continues. And this is a year ago. It's actually my first time in the nonprofit space, and actually I come from the government space, or political space, as you heard in my bio, and so. It's been a little different, but it's been the most impactful work that I've ever done in my career. I think has been in the last year in terms of the work that we've been able to do in Georgia, but also across the nation. So I'm excited about what's to come in the future and the work that we will continue to do in 2020.
Thank you, Ed. We appreciate all the work you're doing, and congratulations and happy anniversary.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So people may assume that folks know exactly what the census is. We see all these commercials going on right now, yeah. A lot of ads, and people may not want to admit if they don't really know. So can you please share with us what the census is and why it's so important?
Absolutely. So, the census is done every 10 years. It's mandated by our Constitution, and something that we've done since 1790. So it's something that's been a continuing part of our democracy. In fact, it is the largest peacetime function of our democracy. So just imagine launching the census with a global pandemic and how much chaos and controversy that could potentially create. And that's kind of where we are right now. Um, you know, but it's easy for people to forget about the census or forget what it means for our communities, particularly when it's only done every 10 years at this magnitude. But I like to say it has three large impacts, right? Three direct impacts. And the first being the funding that comes from the census. And we talk about that a lot. So the 2020 census will direct roughly $1.5 trillion on an annual basis to cities, to towns, to counties, to states across the country. You talk about services like Medicaid, Medicare, WIC, SNAP, food, distribution in terms of school lunch programming, Head Start funding, Pell Grants, infrastructure through transportation. There's more than 300 programs that are directly or indirectly impacted by the funding from the census. The second I like to talk about is the economic development message that comes from the census. And we don't often hear this a lot, but when companies are looking to build a new business or they're looking to relocate their business, they're often looking at census data to drive those population decisions. And so they're not going to relocate to an area where they see the population may be, aging or maybe downsizing. They're looking to, to relocate to an area that's thriving, up and coming, and that type of thing. So we want to make sure that, a municipality has the fair and accurate data so that these companies are able to make those decisions. And then the third is the process of reapportionment, which we know we have 435 congressional seats at the federal level. And those are reapportioned based on the census data every 10 years. And so then through the process of redistricting, they redraw the lines, and some states pick up an additional seat, some lose seat, and we're sort of in that scenario right now where some states are slated to pick up seats for representation, and some are slated to lose them. So we have to really stay at that 435 number. We really don't have any fluctuation there. So you add all of those three things together. We talk about financial power, we talk about political power, but we also talk about the power through the ability to access jobs. So when you think about it from that perspective, when you walk out your house, or we're not walking out of our house too much right now, I hope anyway, but when we walk out of our house and you go about your daily lives, anything you do is really impacted by the census data. And so it's really important particularly for Black communities and households to ensure that they have the fair and accurate count, because in 2010, for instance, 3.8 million Black people were missed in the census. So 3.8 million Black people. 2.2 million of those were 0 to 5. So 2.2 million of those were children. And so, I'm sure we'll get into this in a little bit about why children are so undercounted, but it's really, really important for us to ensure that we are counted, particularly in the Black community.
And you do bring me to the next question about why Blacks are not often counted. And before I ask you that, though, Eddie, you're telling us that the funding that is primarily used in the Black community for early Head Start, for the nutrition programs, the national food programs, for even pre-K, you're telling us that the census counts, if they are not accurate, if we're not counted, we could lose funding in our own communities?
That's correct. And, we'd like to think about it from the lens of, that funding is not just cut off, and that means the federal government keeps that money. That means that money goes to another community somewhere else. And so we're losing out on that in our communities. And the clearest example is education and the overcrowding in classrooms. And so when a school division is often looking to build a new school, they're looking at census data, population data to be able to drive their decisions and be able to estimate what the population of kids will be over a certain period of time. And so what happens is the school division, they look at these estimates, they build a school, then enrollment comes around in the fall, students enroll, they show up for school, and suddenly you have a lot more kids than what you had expected. And that's because those kids, same neighborhood, same community, they have been there. They haven't been anywhere else. They've been in that community. They just have not been counted on the census. And so then we lead to the overcrowding in classrooms. We lead to, sometimes you see the trailers out back and being able to expand the classroom sizes. And so there are a lot of things that we don't think about that are really driven by census data.
Yeah, thank you, Ed. And as a former public school teacher, I have experienced that with, why do we have so many children in our classrooms, or waiting on the numbers to come in, and we had to cut positions, and it's just a lot. So very important. And then finally, with that point about the congressional seats, the legislators. So you're telling us that we could lose seats, we could lose representation in the legislature if we don't complete the census.
That's correct. But primarily, the congressional seats, of course, at the federal level, if you don't have a fair and accurate count, there's a possibility that you lose a voice in Congress. You lose, you think about it from an electoral vote standpoint, you also lose that electoral vote as well in the voting process, particularly for presidential elections. And so it does have a really large impact. And the process of redistricting is not only happen every 10 years at the federal level, but it also happens at the local level. So your school board districts, your city council, your commission, county commission, your state senate, your state house reps, all of those lines are redrawn based on census data every 10 years.
And we need all of those representations, all of those representatives. Thank you. So tell us, Ed, we hear the term hard to count, which we don't really care for that term. Right. But in the census, the Census Bureau, the U.S. Census Bureau has hard to count populations. So minorities and migrants are considered hard to count. Young children are considered hard to count. Tell us, why is it that people in the Black community are considered in that category?
Yeah, it's a historical thing over time. We're looking at populations that typically are missed or undercounted, based on previous census counts. The Census Bureau also looks at holistically looking at a state or looking at a community, and where they have to spend additional resources oftentimes to be able to articulate the message around the importance of the census, or be able to it may take 2 or 3 reminders before people are often reached. And you bring up a really good point about why we don't like to consider that long list of populations of communities as hard to count, because it is a very long list. But we often think of it as a way that the systems, the infrastructure that's been put in place at the federal levels mainly, they've just been put in place at a way that don't reach these communities, right? And it just creates a barrier or hurdle to entry a lot of times. We look at, for instance, one of the largest challenges in 2020 has been that this is the first time the census was primarily online. When it was initially launched in March, roughly 80% of people were pushed to complete it online initially. And I'm just speaking about Georgia here, but roughly 20% of households in Georgia lack adequate access to internet. And we know that's become a really big issue now, with a lot of school divisions pushing their students and families to complete, virtual learning, and there being a barrier, in the home due to that. And the same exists for the census. But there are additional ways to complete the census. But when the first push is to have people do it online, you may discourage people from being a part of that process, or not knowing that there are other methods to complete it as well. So there are challenges. And of course, the completing it online is not a barrier for everyone. It's a convenience for some as well. So I want to be clear in that way. I did complete it online myself, and it takes 10 minutes to do. But we shouldn't be blind to the fact that there are communities, particularly communities of color, that really lack that resource.
Thank you, Ed. So you gave us some really good information about why it's so important to complete the census, what those numbers are used for. For those of our listeners out there who are working with families and they need to make it plain, what can you tell them about what can we tell our families and our people that we're working with every day in plain language? Just some this is why it's so important for you to complete the census, and this is so important for us to not be undercounted in the Black community.
Sure. So one of the things that, certain organizations, nationwide, but also in Georgia, have, have really talked about in terms of making it plain is that education example. Education seems to resonate the best when being relational to families and households, particularly people of color. But one of the easiest things I like to talk about, because this is generally an issue everywhere, is potholes. We have potholes all over our neighborhoods, all over our communities, and we complain about it. They tear our vehicles up. But the money coming in for transportation, the money coming in for infrastructure, all of that is dependent on the census. The Census Bureau, in fact, has a little slogan that they use sometimes and say, the resources, they don't follow the need, they follow the numbers. So they're following the communities that are counted, that are, have the population that, is depicted on paper may not actually be the actual population if they're not counted in the census. So it's really important from that aspect. Again, thinking about those more than 300 programs, we can probably go to anyone and be able to relate to them. This particular issue in your community is related to the census. And so some of the outreach that we're doing currently, through some of our text banking, some of our phone banking to communities that are not responding at the levels in which we would like at this particular point, we're trying to make it relational depending on the county, the city that we're calling into. We make sure to talk about maybe a specific infrastructure project in that community. We talk about an educational issue in that community. The biggest, of course, right now, we talk about the healthcare issues that are plaguing our communities in crisis. Looking at some of the states that maybe have expanded Medicaid versus states that have not, looking at the decrease and decline of rural hospitals. The money coming in from census could drive the healthcare funding as well, particularly as states look to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of the thinking it through that lens, when FEMA, when the CDC is looking to provide resources, they're looking at census data to be able to tell them how much is needed in certain areas. And so that is a really plain and really easy way to be able to show the need of the census right now.
Thank you, Ed. So we showed them how it affects them in terms of in the community. We related to education, we related to the legislature, related to potholes. I love that because, we hate a pothole, right? We have to go get our cars fixed all the time. So that I love that information and the way you laid that out, because sometimes we talk up here and parents just need some plain language. So thank you for that.
That's right.
So there are a lot of consequences of African Americans being undercounted in the census, and you laid those out very well. And you also mentioned the COVID-19 pandemic. So how in the world, in what ways has this pandemic, how has it affected the census? Because I feel like we got off to a great start. We were doing so well, and then COVID-19 hit, and then, things shut down. They slowly started. Some things haven't started back up yet. So tell us in what ways that this pandemic has affected the census for 2020.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. So the census launched officially on March 12th, which was right in the heat of everything going on with COVID as things started to get, really hot and heavy with COVID-19. But, it continued to go on. Like I said, it is a strong pillar of our democracy, and it's mandated by the Constitution. So it is something that must continue to go on. And, the timelines have changed a little bit, and I'll talk about that here in just a second as a result of the pandemic. But, the Census Bureau has also, they had sidelined a lot of their field staff, and in about half of the states, those field staff are this week started to come back online, started to do things, starting to ramp up a little bit more. Of course, keeping in mind the safety and health of those folks, but also the people that they'll be coming in contact with. But roughly, I think 9 million households have already responded to the census. So there's some good news. And roughly almost 60% of households across the nation have responded to the census. And so there has been a good amount of response through the self-response portal. And of course, there are 3 ways you can respond, and that's online at my2020census.gov. You can also call in to complete it, which most people don't realize there is a toll-free number which you can call in. They have a callback option, so I make it pretty easy for you if you don't want to wait or you cannot wait. And then if you, most households by now across the country have received the mail questionnaire Some have received 2 or 3 reminders if you haven't mailed it back in. And so there are a multifaceted approach to it. The one thing that we often relate to the census is that door knocking campaign. And some people think that that's sort of a first method of contact for the census, but it's actually, later down the line, sort of a last resort, so to speak, for people that have not completed the census. And so that part of the operation has been delayed until August for most areas. And so right now, organizations like Farrakhan, BCDI, other nonprofits, along with the Census Bureau, are trying to ensure that people self-respond so that they don't have to, worry about having a knock at the door. They don't have to worry about other methods of outreach later down the line. But initially the census was slated to end on July 31st. And then it was extended for 2 weeks until August 14th. And now the Census Bureau has requested an extension through October 31st. And it looks like that extension will be granted by our congressional leaders, and still some debate going on over that right now. But as you can imagine, that extension is significant because it will have an impact on the state's ability to redistrict in 2021, particularly states like Virginia and New Jersey, who have statewide elections coming up in 2021, and their ability to be able to redistrict and redraw those lines are going to be stifled because of the delay in the census. So, it is going to have a ripple effect. But we also want to make sure that the Census Bureau has a significant amount of time to be able to reach these communities or populations that have not been able to respond at this point. So we're, of course, doing everything that we can to ensure that we're continuing that outreach, and I'm sure we'll talk about some of those techniques that we're doing here in a second.
Yes. And I want you to repeat something, because you said something very important about the door knocking. So we're hearing you say that if we don't want anyone coming to knock on our door to ask us to complete the census, we need to complete it by August. What? Yeah,
so in theory, there's not a specific date in August yet, but just let's use August as a benchmark. If you don't want to, if you want to proactively get it done, you can use one of those 3 methods I just went over to just go ahead and complete the census. You don't have to worry about someone coming to your door trying to get that information, because that is essentially a last resort. We don't know where we'll be in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic in August. And so it may not be something that the Census Bureau is able to do at that time. So we don't want to rely on that method of outreach as sort of the be all end all.
I love that. Thank you. It's very important, you guys. August, get it done now. And it's only taking how long, Ed? They go on my2020census.gov. How long is it taking?
It should take less than 10 minutes for most households. It'll take a little bit longer for households that have, a sizable amount of people residing there. Mm-hmm. But for most households, it'll probably take less than 10 minutes.
Great. And my son completed ours, so he's 22.
Awesome.
And I hear people on the internet, on social media say their children completed it, or they completed it with them, because in 10 years, they'll be on their own and they want to show them how to do it. So this is a great teachable moment for your families, guys. All right, so let's go back to 2010 and talk about what lessons were learned from the results of the 2010 census response rates demographically, and how the Black community can avoid making the same mistakes in 2020.
Yeah, really good question. So I mentioned some of the numbers. 3.8 million Black people were missed in 2010. 2.2 million of them were children 0 to 5. In fact, Black children were twice as likely to be missed or undercounted than their peers. And so, a lot of nonprofits, a lot of organizations looked at that 2010 data and say, well, we can't allow this to happen in 2020. In fact, our communities have suffered for, too long in terms of being underfunded, underrepresented. And so 2020 was the year that we were going to ensure that, they had a fair and accurate count in the 2020 census. And so, as a result, many organizations started the work long before the 2020 census launched. I just mentioned about Farrakhan, and our work was launched, over a year before the census was even slated, to go live. And a lot of people asked us last year, why are you talking about the census, right now? Is other things going on? Isn't that next year? But we're so glad that we were able to, start building that team, building those relationships, building those partnerships a year ago, because now we've seen that they're now more important than ever, to be able to sort of go back and that infrastructure has all been laid out, and we're not starting the process, in 2020. And so, I feel confident that, we want to exceed those self-response, those total response rates from 2010. For instance, in Georgia, the self-response rate was 62%, 62.5% in 2010. We're less than 10 percentage points under that right now, in terms of being able to meet or exceed that. But the total response rate for Georgia in 2010 was 72%. So you think about it, 62 to 72, so 10% of households relied on that door knocking campaign. That was 10% of them were counted via that non-response follow-up, which is that door-to-door enumeration. And so in 2020, we want to make sure we cut down on that 10%, but we also increase the total amount of people that are counted through households.
Thank you, Ed. You offer some great information. And you've mentioned self-response rates a lot. And I know there are some people who are probably thinking, especially the leaders you're on, maybe, where's he getting that information? Is he getting a private report? Can you share with our listeners where they can go to find the response rates?
Yes. So it's, on the Census Bureau website, 2020census.gov. The my2020census.gov will actually take you straight to the questionnaire part of the census, but it's 2020census.gov, those are websites you can visit, route you to the Census Bureau information. They actually have a really interactive map where you can pinpoint your city, your county, your state, even down to the census tract level, on where your self-response rates are on a daily basis. So the census does provide that. They don't tell you how many people, so we're going to keep that in mind. It's how many households have responded. And this number is granular at this point. It is not, depicted down into, how many Black people have been counted and how many Asian American people have been counted. This is strictly households at this point. And this allows us to figure out where we need to send our outreach efforts, where the Census Bureau needs to pump additional resources in. So it's become a really cool way for us to be able to look at this information and data in real time, to be able to allocate resources across the state, but also across the nation. We're working in some additional southeastern states like Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, even looking at some outreach in Nevada, to be able to work with these states on how they can ramp up their efforts as well.
Great. And we've been able to use that data to actually pivot in some areas with our partnership with you guys, Fair Count, United Way of Greater Atlanta, Community Foundation of Greater Atlanta. And we were focusing on some areas that were, the numbers were creeping up, but there were some areas where they weren't. So we were able to target those areas based on looking at the response rates on the website. So for those of you guys out there trying to figure out where to concentrate, that's where you can find the information. So thanks, Ed. So going back, go ahead. Yeah. Go ahead, Ed.
No, I'm good.
So going back to COVID-19, it really has highlighted the deadly disparities amongst the Black community. So how can the 2020 census save our communities from the outcomes such as the ones occurring from this pandemic right now?
Yeah, no, really good question. I wish I actually got that question more, talking about futuristically speaking and how we use the 2020 census to better our communities, right? So, looking at the funding mechanisms, and the way the funding is allocated is probably the top issue, I would say, is, having a fair and accurate count in 2020 will allow the federal government resources, if we have if the count is increasing in some of our areas, and that'll allow additional monies to flow into communities that have been underserved or underfunded for decades in some cases. And so from a strictly resource standpoint, it will allow areas maybe to afford to have an additional hospital, particularly some of our rural areas that we do a lot of work in. And we look at, there are 2 or 3 counties that share a hospital, or one small rural hospital. And as COVID had came onto the scene, I'm just thinking, and Bisa, you and I know now about, sort of southwest Georgia and Albany, the city of Albany there, and all that kind of has plagued that area. But it's really one hospital that has had to suffer the whole load of everything going on. And, you know, the ability for us to have those resources strictly based in healthcare, it's really important for us. Thinking also from an education standpoint about school, you know, free and reduced lunch. When we think about, you know, how divisions receive those monies from the federal government and their ability to be able to distribute food, and we know a lot of divisions are continuing to distribute food even amidst everything that's going on with COVID-19. But if they don't have a fair and accurate count, then their ability to provide the necessary amount of food may be, you know, certainly in dire need of additional resources. And so, you know, as we think about what the next, you know, crisis may be in the future, you know, having a fair and accurate count is really the foundation of how our federal government, but also our state governments, have the ability to be able to respond on a very localized level.
Yeah, thank you, Ed. It does seem what's happening is that, you know, those communities who need the money the most and need the resources the most are the ones that are being affected. So we need to make sure we're continuing our efforts to make sure they know it's important to be counted and that they are counted. And so that brings me to my next question. As organizations are out there, we're out there trying to, you know, figure out how to engage people in the census. We had all these grand ideas and these projects, and, you know, we were going to child care centers for BCDI, and you guys had given us, you've given us Chromebooks, so we're excited. Faircount awarded us 15 Chromebooks, guys, with Wi-Fi and everything, so that we could go out to child care centers and register people to vote, and also register, help them to complete the census questionnaire for parents in child care centers. But of course, we couldn't do that because of the pandemic. So my question is, for organizations like us who are out there trying to mobilize efforts for campaign strategists, you know, what do we do now that COVID-19 has hit without providing in-person interactions? Because you guys had a bus tour. It was so awesome, your bus tour that you had. So
yeah, we had just launched a bus tour, and we only were able to do about 6 stops before we had to cancel. And so we had to cancel roughly 50 of those stops. And so now we're looking at launching a virtual bus tour, which would be pretty cool, probably in the next 3 weeks or so. So that'll be in June and July across the state. But, you know, we've really had to, of course, to do everything virtually. So we've done, you know, a culmination of things, really using our networks on social media and those platforms to be able to bolster a lot of, you know, efforts with the census. You know, Census Day was April 1st, which was really a national day to get people to complete the census. It would, you know, I want to make sure that people understand also that April 1st was not the end all be all. So some people think that, you know, if they didn't complete the census by April 1st, then you don't have additional time to complete it. So I want you to know you still have time to do it if you didn't do it by April 1st. But, you know, we did a really big push on social media that day with a lot of celebrities on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram. And we saw, after that, we saw an uptick in the amount of people who responded, particularly in the state of Georgia. And we've seen that boost come with additional partnerships with people coming together, pushing out to their respective networks. And so it's why really partnerships really matter. And because, you know, BCDI in Atlanta and Georgia, they have a reach. Faircount, we have a reach, and other partners we have a reach. If we all come together and pool our resources, and we can spread that message even farther. And so we've been able to use email, you know, creative ways through email. We've hosted teletown halls, which we will continue to do. One of our initiatives is called Black Men Count, that we focus on making sure that Black men are counted in the census, because they are historically one of the most undercounted populations as well. And so we had a national teletown hall where we reached 60,000 households on one night. And this was a nationwide where we had, you know, 23 states represented on that call as well. We've done, we just finished up a Facebook Live series where we did a 3-part series with some really phenomenal national elected leaders, Black leaders who came and talked about, you know, what undercounted means for our communities, what the process of redistricting means, what voting means for our communities. But also we had two legislators who recently recovered from COVID-19. And they joined us on our last episode, and they were able to give some really good perspective on how COVID-19 has impacted communities, but why we can't allow that to, just stifle everything that we're doing in terms of outreach. So we've really had to be creative. We've used a number of channels to be able to text our networks. We are doing phone banking into areas that we see that the self-response data is not as high as what we would have liked, looking at, historical data. We're also, again, I mentioned at the onset of my presentation that we don't want to be extractive in the work that we're doing. So we're also mindful of the areas that are suffering the most from COVID-19. And so we're looking to provide resources in that way as well, figuring out how we can get folks, applying for benefits in certain areas. And so we do have those internet installations that Bisa talked about that we've been able to partner with. And we have roughly about 140 locations across the state of Georgia that we partner with to provide those Chromebooks or iPads and mobile hotspots. And through that, we've been able to, some of those locations are still open right now, and they're able to social distance and provide guidance on how to be safe when using the devices. But people have used those as means to apply for unemployment, means to apply for other state and federal benefits right now, in addition to completing the census. And so we are making sure that we're not, we understand that right now, the singular thing that's on everybody's mind is their ability to be able to put food on the table, their ability to be safe and healthy in the way that they go about their lives. We would be crazy to think that people are just going around just loving and thinking about the census is not one of those sexy topics. And so we understand that we want to make sure that we're taking care of the whole person in the outreach that we're doing.
Thank you, Ed. And for everyone out there listening, we're about 5 minutes away from questions. So put those in the Q&A so we can answer those. And I want to highlight the technology piece for Fair Count, because we know there's a digital divide. We've been hearing that a lot this week during National Black Child Development Week. And we know that, those computers are going to be so supportive, not just during this time, but you all are allowing these communities and these programs to keep these computers after the census is over. And I just wanted to say, this is wonderful. So 140 sites. And so you guys are decreasing that digital divide. So thank you guys for that work.
Absolutely.
So Fair Count has Black Men Count. We are at BCDI Atlanta. We have Black Children Count, NBCDI Black Kids Count. So look for those hashtag Black Kids Count, hashtag Black Children Count, hashtag Black Men Count. And one of our board members, Kenneth Braswell with Fathers Incorporated, they're doing Black Dads Count. So look for those hashtags out there, guys. Go to blackchildrencount.org, and there's a toolkit that you can use as well, thanks to a lot of the funding that we received from United Way of Greater Atlanta and Community Foundation of Greater Atlanta. So great partners we have out here. So Ed, you've given us some ideas on how we can mobilize our efforts during this pandemic, and thank you so much for that. So I have one final question before we go to Q&A. Why should we, during this time when people need food, they're out of jobs, they need money, they're not getting what they need, why should we prioritize the census? People are trying to get unemployment and they can't. Can you emphasize why we should prioritize the census?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would go out on a limb to say that it's now, even more important than ever, right? And so when we're thinking about what we don't have and the things that we're going through right now and the problems that are plaguing a lot of the communities in which we reside, and that we know we have colleagues that reside, or the people that we serve through kids are residing currently, those issues that we're having and those challenges that we're having, again, are in a lot of ways directly impacted to being fairly and accurately counted in a census. And so being able to, we talk about the need for unemployment benefits and the money. So we talked about the SBA loans that ran out before, a lot of small businesses, particularly small businesses of color, and minority-owned businesses were able to apply for those funds. But those type of programs are directly impacted by funding that comes from the federal government, which of course is then related to the census. And so if we're not being a part of that process and we're not enabling our households to be a part of that process, and then we are shortcoming our households. We're shortcoming our kids, our grandkids in the future to come when you're thinking about, a decade of worth of funding. Each state, there's a site by George Washington University did a study last year called Counting for Dollars. And they broke down each state, and they would say in each state, exactly how much per person that each person was worth in terms of being counted in the census. In Georgia, it was related that $2,300 per person would be lost in funding per year if you were not counted in the census. And so when we talk about that to people, making it relational, we say, you got a 3-person or you got a 2-person household, that's $4,600 every year that you're losing. So over the span of 10 years, $46,000, that your community is losing if you're not counted. And you think about what we could do with $46,000 in a lot of our communities. And so, that's one of the easiest ways to be able to articulate, that message of the importance of it, particularly right now amidst everything that is going on with COVID-19. You also mentioned the hashtags and some of the other initiatives. I want to make sure we didn't leave one out, which is a relatively new initiative for us, which is called Sisters for the Census. And so this is aimed at reaching Black women. And so, sistersforthecensus.org, blackmencount.org. You can get resources. We have toolkits. We have some faith-based toolkits. In fact, we have 2 faith-based toolkits. One of them is for faith congregations, and we do add things to allow our communities to be able to organize virtually right now as well. But one of them is aimed strictly at the Black church and being able to organize there. And so, there are a lot of tools that we provide at our website at faircount.org, that you can download. And then we also have links to our partner websites as well as like BCDI. As well. Share information on Twitter. Tweet us at faircount.org. You can do it right now while you're sitting listening to this presentation. We'll retweet you and share your content as well. But we want to make sure that we are, one, reaching people where they are, because I think I mentioned earlier, the census is not one of those sexy topics that people love to talk about. And so we really have to make sure we're going and taking this message strictly to the people.
Thank you, Ed. And I have to thank you nationally for participating in our census webinar on April 1 on National Census Day. You and C. Murray James, Senior Vice President of Policy at NBCDI. So thank you for that. You mentioned a hashtag during that webinar, which is awesome. I checked it out. It's hashtag #AskStacy. So hashtag #AskStacy. Stacey Abrams, Faircount founder, Faircount and Fair Fight founder. She has some videos out there from celebrities who are talking about the importance of the census. So hashtag #AskStacy is another one that I wanted to mention.
Absolutely. Thank you.
You're welcome. So in the chat, people are saying, Ed, great information, a great mix of relevant topics, something for everyone. This is very informative, changed my perception on the value and importance of the census. So thank you guys for all of your comments, and thank you guys for participating here. So it's time for questions. So Ed shared a lot of great information, which is why I love being on any type of panel with him. He's full of information. And
ditto.
Thank you. What questions do you have for Ed while we have about 14 minutes left during our session?
I see one question there about the toll-free number, and I know, so that's 844-330-2020. Again, 844-330-2020 is a toll-free number nationally that you can call in, and that's in English. They do provide additional, they actually provide 12 other numbers in other languages that you can call in as well, but you can find those at the website. And then the easiest way to register or complete your census is, I think for some people would be to go to my2020census.gov. Again, my2020census.gov to be able to complete the census. Again, most households would have received that paper questionnaire also in the mail by now, or 2 or 3 reminders. It's easy to discard. I wish I had it here on my desk to show what the envelope looks like, but it's easy to discard that information when we get in so much other spam and junk mail, and it comes in a really official looking envelope. So you'll know what it is when it comes to be expected in your mailbox. But also being safe when you receive and go get your mail right now is really important as well. And I know that is a hurdle and obstacle for some as well. But you will receive that mailed questionnaire from most households.
Okay. Go ahead. Go ahead. Mm-hmm.
I got the question. You want me to just go through them here, or
I know you can. Which one do you want to start with? Go ahead. The first one. How can the folks who don't have internet access?
Sure.
Okay. So how can the folks who don't have access to familiarity with webinars become aware of how important completing the census is?
Yeah, so it just goes back to what I was saying a little bit earlier about us trying to be sort of multifaceted in how we do our outreach now virtually, understanding that not everybody is on Facebook, not everybody is on Twitter or Instagram, or not everybody's going to be tuned into a Zoom call or a teletown hall, or an email. One of the things that we've done is we partner with some school divisions to include, in their lunches and the breakfasts that they're distributing, to families on a daily basis. We've also distributed information about how to complete the census very easily. So we include a small postcard in the lunches, in the breakfasts. In fact, we partner with the Atlanta Public Schools and the Community Foundation of Atlanta, and also Georgia for Voices Children to provide over 20,000 flyers to households around Census Day. And this was a creative way to get something about the census in that household with, while being safe, while limiting that in-person interaction. So it's, we've really had to have a multifaceted approach to be able to reach it. And of course, we're still not going to be able to reach everybody. But like with most things, you're not going to be perfect in the work that we do, but we try to be darn near close to it to ensure that we're able to be, reaching particularly the areas that we can reach. And we are hopeful that once we're able to get to some sense of normalcy, or back to doing some sense of in-person interactions, we'll of course keep those social distancing matters at hand, but we will continue to be able to reach people in the fall or the late summer.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned those. I know some of our partners here are handing out flyers and postcards when people go to the food bank and they're putting in their lunches, or the school system to pick up lunches, they are putting them in those bags. So that's a great way to do that as well. So the next couple of questions, Ed, deal with the myths. And this is one reason why we had to create a Black Children Count Toolkit, and why there are so many organizations who are focusing on making sure Black people are counted during the 2020 census, because people think that the census is going to affect them in a negative way. So one question is, will completing the census affect my taxes? And then the next one is, how are there any concerns for undocumented individuals completing the census? Will you speak to those?
Yeah, phenomenal questions. And so the first one I'll take is the tax question. And so no, the census does not affect your tax status or anything related to the tax. One thing we had to clarify several weeks ago was also the census does not impact your federal stimulus check. Most of us probably would have received some type of funding through that assistance through the stimulus package by now. But there was myths going on, or rumors going out, that in order to be able to get that stimulus check, you had to complete your census, which is false. We want people to complete the census, but we don't want to get that done under false pretenses. And so, the completion of the census is not really tied to any one benefit or one program. It's the impact on the back end of the tabulated numbers, which has the direct impact. And so the government, they don't have, outside of the Census Bureau, they don't share your information with other government entities. So they don't share it with, law enforcement. They can't share it with ICE, which we'll get into the second question here in just a second. One of the big things that comes up with kids is the landlord-tenant issues. And so, you have a family living in an apartment dwelling, perhaps, They have 6, 7 people living there. Maybe the lease says that they can only have 4 people living there. And so what happens is they leave 2, 3 people off of the census form thinking that, oh, well, I don't want my landlord to find out I have additional people living here. And that's, simply just not the case. The Census Bureau is not going to share that information with your landlord. But, being able to articulate, those type of things to people that are living in those circumstances or those scenarios is really difficult. And so, that goes back to making it plain. The second question about immigrant communities, and we know that there was a push last year to get the citizenship question added to the census, and we're grateful that that is not on the census. So continue to let people know the citizenship question is not on the 2020 census. So there's no way for them to know whether you're undocumented or not on the census. And that, again, even that information cannot be shared, will not be shared with other government entities. But again, being able to articulate that to people living in those circumstances is still relatively difficult to do. And we've seen through some testing and messaging that, particularly a lot of our immigrant communities are a little skeptical about what the census is and what it will mean for their families. But we want to ensure that people know that it is safe. Also, the census, they'll never ask for your banking information. They won't ask for your account information. They won't ask for your social security number. Those are things that they don't ask for on the, on the census. It's, your name, your age, date of birth, how many people living here, what are their race, the demographics, and those type of information. They're not getting in deep into information that people could then use to prey on you or to scam you out of something.
Thank you, Ed, for that. And you guys can go on the Census website. There's a section there with Q&A, and it will answer a lot of these questions for you as well for these myths. And it's a great time to dispel these myths amongst your family, because a lot of college students are home right now. A lot of people are staying in your home who are not usually there due to the pandemic. So it's a great time to dispel these myths. I know a lot of my son's friends have been texting them the same thing about stimulus checks and all of that. And that's why my son rushed and completed it. And so I've been able to dispel that in my household. So, and just an eye opener of what kind of information gets spread around. And so we have a question here about the early education piece. You talked about how the census can impact the education. Will you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so we talked about Head Start funding. We know that's a big thing, and like the number of slots and the community or a district or division may have, all of that's directly impacted by census data. The funding availability, and some areas. I grew up in a very rural area. In fact, I had the ability to go to Head Start, but I know that not everybody had that opportunity. Pre-K is not an opportunity that everyone has, and so those are things that are depending on a fair and accurate count of our populations and our communities, and the funding will come down from our federal government to be able to flow. So think about it from the size, the overcrowding examples that I gave earlier. We think about it from the number of slots that division may get. We think about, looking at higher education, even the Pell Grants that are provided to a lot of our students are directly impacted by census data. Think about the lunches, the breakfasts, all of those programs that are coming in, have a direct impact on, early childhood education. But there are a number of other grants and federal programs listed. In fact, you can, Counting for Dollars is that initiative I mentioned earlier. You can actually go to that website, Counting for Dollars. If you Google that, pop up. It'll tell you by state how much money your state is slated to get based on the 2020 census for all of these programs. So then you'll be able to take that back to your communities to be able to articulate, exactly what the, benchmark is and sort of why the census is important. It could be that, you're struggling in your area for, the lack of pre-K access. And it may be that, we need to boost these numbers to be able to voice our concerns with the ability to increase those slots. And so I think it really is going to be dependent on, your specific community, on what the needs are in because not every community is the same. But those services are really important around the entire nation.
Thank you, Ed. So, and this may be our last question. These next two kind of go together. We're being asked about resources. People want something they can share with families, a flyer, one pager, and you mentioned several toolkits out there. Is there any particular ones you want to give them certain websites for to make sure they point to those?
Yes, absolutely. And I'm sure Bisa, you would want to send them to your website as well. But they're, they have the at faircount.org. You can also go to, and you can pull down a lot of these resources. There's one that we are working with kids. It's called WeCountKids.org. Again, WeCountKids.org. WeCountKids.org. They provide a slew of resources in terms of being able to download PDFs for coloring, activity books that are centered around the census. These are very diverse books, some of the more diverse activity books that I've ever seen, actually. But, there are some that you can pay for, you can order, but there are also some free downloadable resources there that will allow, teachers through virtual learning or parents to be able to download them and create a conversation with your child, with your family around the census. I mean, and we know that a lot of times the kids can teach the parents something from a lot of these activities. And so,
Yes.
That is one of the things we're partnering with them actually to get a number of activity books in Georgia that we'll be able to disseminate to communities as well.
Thank you, Ed. The piece of funding, all the funding you talked about, is there a piece of, there's one document that they could share that has that great information about where the funding goes? What's the best place for them to find that?
Yeah, so the Counting for Dollars is going to be the one that I was speaking about earlier, because that one literally allows you to look at the state and figure out how the geographical distribution of funds is kind of done. And again, it's George Washington University. It's through their site. And if you Google George Washington University Counting for Dollars, it will take you to that site. Then you can kind of go through those federal programs, because I don't have all of the information in my head about each state and how much per person for each state and that type of thing. But that is the best resource to be able to pull that information down.
Thank you, Ed. And as we get ready to close, I know we have one last question, and I feel like the answer to this last question about how to reach people is to partner. I can't stress that enough. We couldn't do what we do without the support of Fair County, United Way, and all the NBCDI and all the other organizations we partner with. So, Ed, one parting thought as we close our session today.
Absolutely. Again, when everybody that's on this call, listening in, watching, I want you to take out your phones, text 5 to 10 people in your networks, ask them have they completed the census. If they've not, push them to my2020census.gov. The second call to action I would ask you to do is go on Twitter and to say, based on this presentation from Bisa and I today, why is the census important to you? What does it mean for your family? And maybe do a short tweet about that and get other folks in on the action as well. But thank you so much for the invitation. I really enjoyed the conversation as always, and I look forward to the continuing work with BCDI and also the national affiliate, the NBCDI as well.
Thank you, Ed, for your time today. You guys have a wonderful day, and don't forget to complete your census.
Thank you.
You're welcome.